Weimar Germany, November 1923. A single loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks. A lifetime of savings, if kept in marks, buys nothing. A bank account that could have purchased a house just a few years earlier can barely afford food. 5 years. That is all it took for a stable currency to turn into worthless paper. The money did not slowly fade. It collapsed violently and completely, leaving behind shock, disbelief, and ruin. Yet, not everyone was destroyed. Some people survived. A smaller group even emerged stronger, not because they predicted the exact timing of the collapse, but because they followed principles at work in every collapse, regardless of the country, the century, or the political system. The same story repeated itself in Argentina in 2001. The peso was frozen. Banks closed their doors. Depositors were locked out of their own accounts. Dollar savings were confiscated by the government and forcibly converted into pesos at a rigged exchange rate. Overnight, 2/3 of people's savings vanished. Once again, most people lost everything. And once again, a minority survived by following the same rules that had worked in Germany, in Rome centuries earlier, and in every recorded monetary failure. Today, the United States is walking the same path. The national debt stands at $36 trillion. The dollar has lost roughly 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. In just 2 years, the Federal Reserve created $5 trillion. The pattern is not new. It is identical to the pattern that preceded every major currency collapse in history. When the next collapse comes, whether in 5 years or 15, the outcome will not depend on intelligence, effort, or moral virtue. It will depend on whether people follow principles that survive collapse or tactics that only work in normal times. Understanding this is not about getting rich. It is about not losing everything. In every collapse, the majority are wiped out, not because they are foolish, but because they rely on strategies designed for stability. These strategies fail catastrophically when the system breaks. The principles that protected wealth in ancient Rome still worked in Weimar Germany. They worked in Argentina. They will work again. Before discussing them, it is essential to understand why principles matter more than tactics. A tactic is specific advice: buy gold, sell stocks, hold cash, rebalance your portfolio. Tactics depend on timing, execution, and assumptions about how the system functions. A principle is a fundamental truth that holds regardless of conditions. Principles worked when gold was money. They worked when paper replaced gold. They will work whether the next collapse arrives through inflation, deflation, a banking freeze, or a currency reset. Most financial advice today is tactical. Buy this fund. Hold 60% stocks and 40% bonds. Max out retirement accounts. All of this assumes functioning markets, solvent banks, enforceable contracts, and governments that honor promises. In a collapse, those assumptions break. Courts stall. Banks fail. Governments rewrite rules overnight. Only principles remain. The first principle is simple and brutal. Hard assets survive, paper burns. When currencies collapse, governments default, and financial systems seize up, physical assets retain value because they are real. Paper assets, anything that represents a claim on something else, can disappear when that claim can no longer be enforced. In Weimar Germany, someone with 100,000 marks in a bank account in 1918 was wealthy. By 1923, that same balance could not buy bread. Paper wealth evaporated. Those who owned land, building factories, or farms survived. A farm in 1918 was still a farm in 1923. It produced the same food. Its real value did not change. Only the price and marks exploded. Zimbabwe in the 2000s followed the same script. Hyperinflation reached almost 80 billion% per month. Savings held in Zimbabwean dollars became meaningless. But farmland, livestock, and equipment preserved value because they produced necessities. Argentina repeated the lesson. Bank deposits were frozen, then forcibly converted. The currency collapsed. The pattern did not change. Hard assets endured. Paper claims did not. Today, most American wealth exists as paper. Stocks, bonds, pensions, retirement accounts, and bank deposits. These are not assets themselves. They are promises. In stable times, promises work. In collapse, promises fail. Real estate remains real estate. Gold remains gold. A productive piece of land remains productive. The second principle follows naturally. Own productive assets, not speculative ones. Productive assets generate value regardless of market opinion. Speculative assets only have value if someone else is willing to pay more later. During the Great Depression, the stock market fell nearly 90%. Those who owned stocks for speculation were wiped out. Those who own productive assets directly, farms, rental properties, operating businesses, still receive output. A farm produces food whether markets are open or closed. A rental property provides shelter people need regardless of asset prices. Speculative assets collapse when buyers disappear, and in crises, buyers vanish. Venezuela's stock market rose astronomically in nominal terms, but the currency collapsed even faster. Investors gained nothing in real terms. Meanwhile, people who own bakeries, farms, or transportation businesses survive because they produce essentials. Modern markets are dominated by speculation. Stock indices rise because people believe they will rise. Many assets produce nothing on their own. In collapse, belief is not enough. Production is. Assets that feed, house, transport, or provide energy retain value because they solve real problems. Speculation does not. The third principle is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Debt destroys you in a collapse, even so-called good debt. In stable times, debt amplifies gains. In collapse, it magnifies losses. Income falls or disappears, but debt obligations remain fixed. Banks do not accept excuses. If you cannot pay, they seize the asset. During the Great Depression, farmers borrowed heavily during the prosperous 1920s as land prices rose. When prices collapsed, debt remained. Farms were foreclosed en masse. The same pattern occurred in every crisis since. Debt turns temporary hardship into permanent loss. In a collapsing system, leverage becomes a weapon used against you. The fourth principle is liquidity and mobility. In crises, flexibility is survival. Those who can move, adapt, and access resources fare better than those trapped by rigid systems. When banks closed in Argentina, cash goods and informal networks replaced formal finance. In Weimar Germany, barter and foreign currency became lifelines. Systems change overnight. The ability to operate outside official channels becomes critical. The fifth principle is psychological discipline. Panic destroys wealth faster than inflation. In every collapse, fear drives people to make irreversible decisions at the worst possible moment. Those who survived did not react emotionally to headlines or government announcements. They acted deliberately, conserving resources and focusing on long-term survival rather than short-term comfort. These principles are not predictions. They are patterns observed repeatedly across centuries. Collapse does not announce itself politely. It arrives through policy errors, political pressure, and gradual erosion that suddenly becomes obvious. When that moment comes, tactics fail. Principles endure. Those who align their lives and assets with these principles do not need to predict the future. They only need to recognize that history does not change, even when technology does. Crop prices collapsed. Farm income fell by 50 to 70% almost overnight. But the debt did not collapse with it. Between 1930 and 1935, more than 750,000 American farms were foreclosed. Families who had worked the same land for generations lost everything. Not because the land stopped producing, but because debt turned a temporary downturn into permanent ruin. The soil was still fertile. The barns were still standing. What failed was leverage. Now compare that to farmers who owned their land free and clear. They suffered too. Prices were terrible. Cash was scarce. Life became hard. But they survived. Without mortgage payments. They lived on what the farm produced. They ate their own food. They sold what they could. Debt-free farmers endured. Indebted farmers were erased. The same economy, the same weather, the same collapse, completely different outcomes determined by one variable, debt. Argentina repeated this lesson in 2001. Middle-class families had mortgages denominated in U.S. dollars because dollars are considered safe. When the peso collapsed, peso incomes fell by roughly 66%, but the mortgage payment stayed fixed in dollars. People lost two-thirds of their income, yet their debt obligation did not change. They simply could not pay. Banks foreclosed on homes people have been paying into for 10 or 15 years. Entire lives of effort disappeared. Meanwhile, families who owned their homes outright experienced the same income collapse, the same inflation, the same chaos, and kept their homes. Same crisis, same country, same shock. No, debt meant no foreclosure. Greece in the 2010s followed the same pattern. Incomes fell 30 to 40%. Pensions were cut in half, but mortgages stayed the same. Default exploded. Debt did not just hurt people. It finished them. Today, Americans hold roughly $17 trillion in household debt, $12 trillion in mortgages, over $1.5 trillion in auto loans, student loans approaching $2 trillion, credit card debt over $1 trillion. This structure only works in a stable system with rising incomes, functioning banks, and predictable rules. In a real crisis, that debt becomes a weapon. Millions of families will not be destroyed by lack of effort or intelligence, but by obligations they can no longer service. The common counterargument is that inflation helps debtors. If you owe $300,000 and inflation runs at 20%, the real value of your debt falls. This is theoretically true if your income keeps up. In actual collapses, it does not. Wages lag. Jobs disappear. Payment schedules stay fixed while income becomes unstable. Inflation without income growth does not save debtors. It crushes them. The only truly safe position is zero debt. Own assets free and clear. If you own a house with a mortgage, you do not own a house. You own a leverage bet that prices remain high, banks remain solvent, and your income remains uninterrupted. If you own a house outright, you own it, period. No bank can take it. Debt is leverage in expansion. Debt is suicide in collapse. The fourth principle is less obvious, but just as powerful. Skills are the only truly portable wealth. Every other form of wealth can be taken. Land can be seized. Gold can be confiscated. Money can be inflated away. Businesses can be nationalized. Skills live in your head. They cannot be taxed, frozen, or devalued. History makes this brutally clear. During the Holocaust, Jewish families owned property, businesses, and savings. Almost all of it was confiscated. Those who survived often did, so because they had skills. Doctors, engineers, craftsmen, tailors, people who could do something useful were able to trade labor for food, protection, or passage. The wealthy merchant who owned buildings but had no practical skills starved. The craftsman who owned nothing but knew how to build survived. The Soviet Union from 1917 to the early 1920s provides the same lesson. The Bolsheviks seized private property almost overnight. Aristocrats who owned vast estates lost everything instantly. Engineers, doctors, machinists, and skilled workers retained value because the new state needed them. Skills created leverage even under totalitarian control. The aristocrat with 10,000 acres but no skill starved. The blacksmith who owned nothing but could make tools survived. Vietnam in 1975 reinforced this principle yet again. When Saigon fell, millions fled. They could not take land. They could not take businesses. They could not take wealth. Vietnamese refugees who rebuilt most successfully in the United States were those with skills: doctors, engineers, accountants, mechanics. They arrived with nothing tangible. Within a generation, they built stable, prosperous lives because skills transfer across borders and systems. In modern America, most wealth is locked into financial assets and real estate. None of this is portable. If capital controls are imposed, money may not move. If borders close, property stays behind. Skills move with you. Yet most people have no practical skills that function outside complex systems. Ask a simple question. Could you produce food, repair equipment, build shelter, or provide medical care without institutional support. These skills are valuable in every economy, booming or broken. Skills are the foundation of rebuildable wealth. They do not replace assets, but they make recovery possible when assets are lost. Everything else can be taken. Skills cannot. The fifth principle ties everything together. Local trust networks outlast all institutions. When systems collapse, institutions fail. Banks close. Governments lose authority. Police lose capacity. Laws stop being enforced consistently. But local networks of trust survive. They always have. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, the government dissolved, the currency became worthless. Pensions stopped and supply chains broke. Grocery stores were empty. People survived through family networks, neighbors, and informal exchange. Those embedded in strong local relationships shared food, labor, and security. The people who survived best were not the richest on paper. They were the most connected. Argentina in 2001 saw the same phenomenon. When banks closed, neighborhood assemblies formed. Communities organized barter systems, shared resources, and provided mutual protection. Informal networks became more reliable than the state. Lebanon, after 2019, offers a modern example. The currency lost 90% of its value. Banks effectively shut down. The government became dysfunctional. Yet Lebanon did not collapse into total chaos because family, religious, and community networks stepped in where institutions failed. Before modern states, all economic life functioned through trust networks. You traded with people you knew. You borrowed from those who trusted you. Modern institutions scale beyond local trust, but when they fail, society reverts to older systems. The problem in America today is that most people are institutionally connected but locally isolated. You have a bank account, but do not know your neighbors. You rely on Walmart, but do not know a single local farmer. You trust police and courts, but have no community fallback. This is extreme fragility. When institutions fail, there is nothing beneath them. Building local networks, now knowing neighbors, developing reciprocal relationships, embedding yourself in a community is not social advice. It is survival strategy. As institutional trust erodes, local trust becomes priceless. The connected person survives. The isolated individual struggles. These principles are not theoretical. They have been tested repeatedly across centuries and continents. Hard assets survive while paper burns. Productive assets outlast speculation. Debt destroys and collapse. Skills are portable wealth. Local trust networks endure when institutions fail. History does not change. Only the costumes do. Local networks outlast institutions. That is where the list ends. And notice what is not on it. There is no mention of which stocks to buy, which cryptocurrency will survive, whether gold is better than silver, or which fund outperforms next year. Those are tactics. They change with technology, regulation, and fashion. Principles do not. These principles worked in ancient Rome. They worked in Weimar Germany. They worked in Argentina, Greece, the Soviet Union, and every other collapse on record. They will work again. The power of principles is that they do not require perfect timing. You do not need to know the exact year, month, or trigger the collapse. You do not need to predict interest rates, elections, wars, or central bank decisions. You position your life according to what survives collapse, and timing becomes irrelevant. Own hard assets instead of paper claims. Whether the crisis arrives in 5 years or 20, hard assets preserve real value in both stability and chaos. Own productive assets. If the system remains functional, they generate income and resilience. If it breaks, they still produce food, shelter, energy, or services people need. Eliminate debt. In good times, debt-free living gives flexibility and peace of mind. In collapse, it is the difference between survival and foreclosure. While debtors are wiped out, those without obligations endure. Develop skills. In stable economies, skills increase income and opportunity. In collapse, skills become your only truly portable wealth. They allow you to trade value for necessities, rebuild in new environments, and remain useful regardless of political or financial systems. Build local trust networks. In normal times, they provide community and support. In collapse, they become survival infrastructure security, exchange information, and mutual aid when institutions fail. These principles improve your life now. They are not sacrifices made for some distant disaster. The mistake most people make is waiting for certainty. They want confirmation. They want a signal so obvious that no one can deny it. But collapses do not announce themselves. They unfold gradually, then suddenly. By the time the evidence feels undeniable, the window to act is already closing. This is the genius of principles. They free you from prediction. You do not guess the future. You align with what has always worked when systems break. These principles are ancient because they are rooted in human behavior and mathematics. When debt exceeds the ability to pay, collapse follows. When currency is debased, paper wealth evaporates. When institutions fail, local relationships matter more than laws. These are not forecasts. They are patterns repeated hundreds of times across thousands of years. The American collapse, whenever arrives and however unfolds, will follow the same underlying structure. The specific tactics will be different. Technology will look different, but the principles will be identical. Hard assets survive. Productive assets generate value. Debt destroys. Skills travel. Local networks endure. Position yourself according to these principles now, and you dramatically increase your odds of surviving what is coming. Ignore them and chase tactics instead, and you are gambling that you can time the collapse perfectly. History shows that most people lose that bet. If this made one thing clear, it is that principles matter more than tactics. The same 5 principles have survived every collapse in recorded history, and you can begin aligning with them today without predicting exact timing. The principles tell you what matters. The tactics only tell you how to execute within a specific moment. These principles worked in Rome, in Weimar, in Argentina, and everywhere else systems failed. They will work again. The only real question is whether you act before the window closes or regret it after it does.